Hi, this is Tom Needham. Welcome to Sounds, where we delve into the critical issues shaping our world with the leaders who influence them. Today, I'm very honored to welcome former ambassador to the OSCE and former Virginia Governor Jim Gilmore. I might add that he also ran for president a couple times. Known for his decades of public service and expertise in international relations, Governor Gilmore is here to discuss the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia, the geopolitical implications of the conflict, and how diplomacy might bring it to an end. Drawing on his experience as a former ambassador and his recent op ed in support of General Keith Kellogg's appointment as special envoy to Ukraine, Governor Gilmore offers actionable strategies for ending this devastating war. From the importance of Russia's adherence to international agreements to proposals for security zones and NATO membership delays, this promises to be a compelling and thought provoking discussion about the path to peace in Europe. Jim, thank you so much for joining us on Sounds.
Good. Thank you very much, Tom. I'm glad to be here with your listeners.
Well, so much going on. What do you see as the root cause, first off, of this conflict in Ukraine?
The long-term root cause and strategic cause is the gravity to the West. There is a sense that Western democracy, Western economic values, Western cultural values, I think, are pulling more and more people to the West. I believe what we're seeing now is resistance to that from the authoritarians in Russia and China and Iran, North Korea. I think they see that their days are numbered. And what they really need to do is to try to reverse history. And I think that's what Putin is trying to do. He has already stated in public that he wants to rebuild the Russian Empire. This is not a defensive maneuver on the part of Russia. They are not threatened by Ukraine. They're not threatened by NATO. They're certainly not threatened by the United States. This is an aggressive effort to actually rebuild the Russian Empire by expansion and domination of people in Ukraine and frankly beyond. And I think that's why that the Europeans are so forthright about this in the ongoing conflict, Tom.
One of the things that struck me was how quickly, when this invasion began, major corporations ended their business in Russia right away. McDonald's, Starbucks, and many others just pulled out, and this is after them investing millions and putting lots of time to make new markets there, and it kind of just made me wonder at that time, do they know that this is serious, that this is going to be long term? Because businesses don't want to give up that. What did you make of how quickly U.S. corporations that had business over there kind of wrapped things up?
Well, I'm gratified by it. My political history is long, and my experience is that the business community cannot be depended upon for any type of political goal. Their objective, Wall Street's demands, and frankly, the law demands that corporations maximize the value to their shareholders. For them to make a decision which is consistent with American and Western foreign policy is very gratifying. And I hope that the government had something to do with it, frankly, in order to understand that we are in a World War III global conflict right now. It's going to end up in the long run being a fight for the life of all of us that are listening on this podcast. And I'm gratified that the Western business community would go along with this for whatever reason that they're doing it.
Can you speak really quickly to the stereotypes that the different political parties have had through the years in terms of the anti-war movement? Um, it's not everyone, but for many, many years, people who were anti-war were often associated with one wing of the Democratic Party. But in recent years, particularly the last couple of years, it seems that there's a fraction of the Republican Party that's become more anti-war. What do you make of that?
Well, politics in America changes from year to year and from decade to decade. And I think what we have to keep our eye on here is the fact that this conflict that we're in is going to be a long conflict. This is going to be a long war. It's possible, by the way, the authoritarians could collapse overnight, both the Russia, especially the Russians, but perhaps even the Chinese. And I think they understand that, and that's why they're being so aggressive. But clearly, the authoritarian countries believe that the Western order, led by the United States and its allies, is not in their best interest. And so they want to change it. But you don't do that overnight. In fact, you engage in a long term war. Now, politically, you ask the question, what about this? Well, it is true that we're seeing a rise of the isolationist sentiment in the Republican Party, and I am against that. I understand what's going on. I've been not only a governor and dealt with the administration of an entire state, but I've been a United States ambassador to an international organization in Vienna, Austria. I understand, I think, the nature of this conflict that's going on here. So there's going to be a continuing discussion in the Republican Party. Now, the President of the United States is going to have a lot to say about that, and his appointments right now are being made. But I am frankly optimistic that as time goes on, that the Trump administration is going to understand that people like Vladimir Putin are people you simply can't really do business with. And when that time comes, I believe the United States economic, military, cultural values, power will prevail together with our allies.
And as I mentioned earlier, you just wrote this op-ed, and you have a plan that you believe in could actually end things peacefully. What is that plan exactly?
Well, again, the op-ed that I wrote that I have published and that I'm going to continue to publish through email and through social media is my first stab at what I think the situation is. Now, I support Keith Kellogg. I know him personally. I'm acquainted with him through the America First Policy Institute. He has been named by President Trump to begin this negotiation. And all I've really said in my op-ed is, I'm for you. I hope that you can work things out to end the war, but it really needs to be on terms that presume and commit to the Western values and liberties that the world is craving. That being said, the Russians are not likely to give in to Keith Kellogg on the very first day. In fact, the Russian foreign policy people this very day have already announced that they're not going to give in to anything in terms of negotiations with Keith Kellogg. Some of the oligarchs have announced the same thing, that they're going to tell him to take a hike. So if that should occur, I've really offered a different suggestion. And my suggestion is this: the international order that's represented by Western values and the values and charter of the OSCE, which is the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is where I was ambassador, state that aggression, particularly in Europe, is not acceptable, or anywhere in the world for that matter. And therefore, my plan is that the Russians need to get out of Ukraine. They committed to the defense of the borders of Ukraine in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, as well as the Americans and the British. They need to adhere to that obligation. They need to get out of Ukraine. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what do they get? Well, I mean, I think they get a lot under Gilmore thinking here. First of all, I have suggested reluctantly a postponement of NATO membership, not a pledge to never join NATO membership, because that's what the Russians want, but they're not entitled to that. The principles of the OSCE, or any country can join any alliance that it wants to, but a postponement would not be a revocation of that. I've suggested that there be a patrolling along the Ukrainian-Russian border, not the border of conflict right now. That would recognize Russian conquest, and that's not acceptable to me, and shouldn't be acceptable to any of us. But once the Russians go back home to their own country, then their side of the border can be patrolled by civil authorities on this fiction that somehow they're under some sort of threat, but they're really not. But more powerfully, the Ukrainian border should be patrolled by military battalions from Western countries, not necessarily NATO countries, because that would be sort of a Putin excuse for rejecting it.
Hmm.
These can be bilateral agreements. But those are my suggestions, Tom, for getting out of this right now and stopping this conflict if, in fact, the initial negotiations do not succeed.
I know you said earlier that Russia is to blame for this. What do you make, though, of people who make the case that Russia has been upset through the years as other countries have joined NATO and have just basically been lining up against his border, and that always has been unacceptable and a breach of some kind of agreement from the past?
Look, Russia was turning in the right direction at the time of Gorbachev and Yeltsin. They became an authoritarian dictatorship under Putin. They are not threatened by anybody. And just because they have in their minds some fiction that maybe they're under some sort of threat, doesn't mean that we all have to go along with it and agree to Russian conquest and fascist behavior and atrocity and stealing of children and murder. That approach to international relations is something we don't have to accept just because of something that's in their heads. But in the meanwhile, I think that we have to admit that Russia is not under any kind of threat. That's not what's going on. The Tucker Carlson interview, which I disapprove of, I disapproved of his going to Moscow, but it didn't stop me from actually looking at the Putin interview. He made it quite clear, Putin did in that interview, that his goal is the reassembly of the old Russian Empire. Well, the Poles, the Baltic countries, Eastern Europe, and for that matter, Western Europe, are not going along with that, and the United States shouldn't either. We're in a time right now where there is a possibility of world peace because of the prevalence of Western success and Western values. History simply cannot be reversed. And I think if you look at the overall picture of what's going on in the world today, I think we can see that freedom is on the march and that Putin has no chance of reversing history and reassembling that empire. But he's meanwhile killing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people along the way.
I've heard astronomical numbers in terms of the loss of life so far in this conflict. What are the numbers that you're hearing?
Well, the numbers that I'm hearing are the public numbers, and that is that the Russians have suffered over 750,000 losses and killed and wounded. Sadly enough, they've also inflicted a couple of 100,000 casualties on Ukraine, who are innocent victims of this, the same way that the Czechs were innocent victims of Hitler or the Poles were innocent victims of Hitler. That is something that's going on. I might mention, by the way, in my plan, I make no mention of what really ought to be done here, and that is that there needs to be a war crimes tribunal to bring the Russians to book on this. And frankly, Putin and Lavrov ought to be prosecuted as war criminals. I haven't even said anything about that. We could put that aside if we could bring this conflict to an end to stop the suffering of Ukraine. But that I think is a long way to go in this, and we still have a lot to do. Now, let me be clear. I don't have any illusions about this. I think that the Russians are not going to just give in. They've already said this very day that they're not going to give in. But it doesn't matter. We have to do what's right. And what's right on this is not only protecting Ukraine, which is not the most important thing, but protecting Europe as a central ally of the United States, and ultimately protecting the United States of America in this global conflict that we're in right now.
One of the big moments in this conflict was the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. And there's all kinds of theories out there as to what happened, who's to blame. What are your thoughts on this? And whoever did it, why was it a very significant event? What did that pipeline mean in the region?
When I was United States ambassador, we were holding the line on Russia, and I was Trump's ambassador to OSCE, and I was holding the line on this issue, and I still am talking to you about it and everybody else. But one thing that happened when President Biden came into office, he sent very definite signals to the Russians that they could get away with their invasion. And one of those was the Nord Stream pipeline. He basically took sanctions off the Nord Stream pipeline. Now, all of a sudden, shortly thereafter, we see the destruction of that pipeline. Well, we don't know who did that, but certainly the Russians wouldn't destroy their own pipeline. Some of the Europeans were making money by the use of that pipeline, so I don't know why they'd be doing it. Somebody, though, did it, and frankly, it's a plus because it begins to demand that Europe get off of the European gas pipeline. And I think that's probably a positive economic development, even though I have no idea who destroyed that pipeline.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues tied into this conflict, and one of them is economic. Um, there's been sanctions levied against Russia. There's also all this talk about BRICS nations coming together, threatening the U.S. dollar. Um, how significant is all this financial stuff that's going on?
Well, I'll answer you in a couple of ways. First of all, the sanctions, I was frankly skeptical that sanctions as a tool of economic conflict really work. It seems to me that people immediately go to work doing workarounds against sanctions. But and I want to repeat that in hybrid warfare, the comprehensive warfare, you look at every element, not just military, but you look at economic messaging. Particularly, the Russians are very good at messaging. So am I right now with you, by the way.
Hmm.
But the fact is that sanctions do seem to be working, and it looks like to me that the Russian economy is about to collapse. The ruble has collapsed. There are all kinds of problems that they're having. The Russians are having to go to other countries in order to try to get some support. They're going to other countries to sell their oil cheap so that they can stay afloat. I think that the sanctions are working in this case. And I think that, frankly, whatever we're doing right now, we ought to triple because we're in a conflict here. This is not a business decision. This is a conflict that's going on, and that we have to use those kinds of sanctions to make things work. So that's kind of my view, Tom. Frankly, I think the people of America need to wake up to what's going on here, because this conflict is very real. And if the authoritarians pull the trigger, we can be in a general military conflict globally.
And that's really what I want to get a sense from. There are some people who are saying that we're right on the edge, and nuclear war is a possibility. Minimally, a very serious ground troops type of war is a very real possibility. How close do you think we are to some of these possibilities?
Let me make it clear to your listeners that Jim Gilmore wants to avert that possibility. My goal here is not to engage in war; it's to prevent war. But the second point is that we have this tendency, Americans, to blame ourselves for everything. We're the ones that are at fault. We're the ones that are doing the wrong things, and poor innocent victim Putin is just defending himself. That's all a bunch of garbage. The fact is that we're in a conflict right now, and we have to defend ourselves, and that is reality. Are we close to a nuclear conflict? Yes, we are. And who's the cause of that? Not us. The fascist dictator in Moscow is the cause of this. If you'll get his troops out of another country and go home and do something to try to rebuild his own country, then we're not going to have a global conflict. But Putin is not going to respond to weakness. If he prevails in Ukraine, in my view, that compromises the politics of East Europe. It compromises the politics of West Europe. And the message that I've got to have for your listeners is this: if Europe is compromised, becomes neutralized, because it makes its deals and decides that it doesn't really want to depend on the United States in any way, then that is a existential, a existence threat to the United States of America. Now, this is not mysterious, Tom. We understood this in World War II. Franklin Roosevelt immediately saw that Europe was the key to the global conflict that went on between Germany and Japan. And it's still the case today. The United States needs Europe as an ally, and we have them today. But if we falter in our global leadership, they'll make their best deals because that's what people do.
So, Jim, what do you make of all the rhetoric that President Trump has delivered in recent years about NATO and them not paying their fair share and that kind of stuff? What's your stance on NATO?
Well, I support the idea that our allies have to step up and be better allies. I agree with Trump's position that because of America's leadership, our allies decided to take a long nap. And the fact is, they do need to build up their industries, and they need to build up their defense, and they need to build up their militaries and be real allies to the United States. When I was Trump's ambassador in Vienna to OSCE, I made it quite clear to our allies that the United States was not going to write a blank check for their defense, or OSCE's defense, or Europe's defense. They had to step up and be partners in the conflict, and they did. When we put that policy forward, they did step up, and they're stepping up today, Tom. So Trump was right about this before he showed up on the scene in 16. There was no discussion of this. He's right about this. However, NATO is an essential alliance in my view, and I think that we're going to continue to be in that alliance. Now, one more point: we don't actually know Trump's policy here, not really. We know this, that when Obama was president and the conflict broke out in Ukraine in 2014, he sent meals to rations to Ukraine. When Trump came in, he sent Javelin missiles, and that made the difference in the invasion in Ukraine. So you have to look at Trump's actual acts, not what he says, but what he does. And right now, I'm optimistic that Trump will be a stronger leader. I think people in Ukraine and people in Europe believe that to be the case. And I think that what we're headed for, though, is a confrontation with General Kellogg's efforts that are going to be made. It's really up to Putin. He can bring about peace. I suggested something like that. I'm not even demanding that he be tried as a war criminal at this point. But there are a few concessions that we can make, but not territory. If Putin and Russia conquer through military effort, I think that it's Katie bar the door for the 21st century.
As someone who has worked as an ambassador in Europe, can you give us a little bit of your sense of what the European leaders and people are feeling right now about this conflict that maybe is different than what some Americans are feeling?
I think that it's different in that I think that the Europeans are a little closer to reality than the Americans are. I think the Americans are still over here feeling sort of isolated and secure. The Europeans understand exactly how dangerous this is, and that's why you're seeing the Poles and particularly the Baltic nations stepping up, and they're saying the right things. I talked to you a little bit a while ago about messaging,
Mm.
about military sanctions, economics, and messaging. The Russians are geniuses at disinformation and messaging. The Westerners are still learning that, but the Poles and the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, the Czechs, these people are all understanding exactly what's going on. And I think that they have a much more realistic view of what's going on in the European conflict and the global conflict. But let me also say this: I actually, as ambassador, interacted with 56 other ambassadors in 56 other countries in the OSCE. OSCE contains everybody that's in it, including the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Turks and the Scandinavian countries and all the rest of Europe, even into Central Asia. I interacted with all those ambassadors and got a feel for things. The Europeans are prepared to continue to follow American leadership and depend upon America. But if they think that Russia is on the march, then I worry that the politics of those countries will be mitigated and polluted not to America's best interest.
I'm so happy to have a chance to speak with you to get your sense about this. We've been talking mainly about Russia and Ukraine, but there's all this talk about could something happen with China and Taiwan. The Middle East right now is in a major war situation. Syria has collapsed. Um, how likely is it that some of these different things that are going on could somehow all get tied up together in one world war, or is that already happening in your mind?
Two things. Take note of the fact that the Syrian collapse is a tremendous strategic loss for Russia and for Putin. Their warm water port there in Syria is threatened. Their soldiers are being thrown out and maybe killed by these people that are coming in. So once again, I think history is on the march. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that these people that are taking over Syria are good guys. What I am saying is that this is a big loss for Russia strategically. Now, to answer your question, I would encourage your listeners to remember that all of this is linked. That all of this is representative of the big global shift that's underway. I've never seen this many countries unstable as we're seeing right now. But I think I see the germ of success of the Western leadership and Western values and democracy and everything that's going on. And sure, I mean, it's all linked. The Americans have a tendency to segment peace versus military and Pacific versus Europe. There is unrest across the entire planet now. The challenge of American leadership is to bring this out right and to have a success for democracy and freedom in the world so that we don't live in societies where the knock on the door comes in the middle of the night by the secret police, that we don't see conquest of free people to authoritarian people. And America can lead this way. We're holding almost all the high cards. We have to just be prepared to be forthright and steady and strong in our leadership, and this is going to come out okay. And a third world war, a military war, can be averted, Tom. But there's still time, but time is growing shorter and against that day.
And there's some that have a sense that when January comes around and when President Trump gets in, that's going to be the next chapter, whether it's good or bad, but that events are going to start to unfold. To the best of your ability, what is your prediction? What are we going to start to see in January and February in terms of the next step of this conflict?
Well, once Biden came in, he fired all the Republicans worldwide as ambassadors, myself included. So let me be clear, I do not speak for the Trump administration, and I don't have a crystal ball to know exactly what American policy will be. We know that Keith Kellogg is going to go over and put his toe in the water and see what can be done. But my principles that I've stated here today, I think, are very strong, and I think that we're going to end up there. I hope we do. I don't know what Trump is going to do. I don't know what his appointees are going to do. I don't know who all his appointees are going to be at this point. So we just have to watch and see what happens. But I believe this. I believe that Putin is probably so far in with over 750,000 people lost that he can't back up. And that is the danger here. If President Trump is a strong leader, as I know he is, and different from Biden, if he is a strong leader, I think there is a real danger of a real confrontation here if these negotiations falter at the very beginning. Uh, if Putin stands his ground, and I almost see no way he can back up, and Trump stands his ground, and I think he's a strong personality, there is extreme danger here in the immediate future that this conflict will get worse. But on the other hand, if we stand strong and resolute, and Putin cannot advance and cannot carry out his dreams and his delusions of conquest, I think over time, my hope is that a country like Russia will be more civilized and that China will look at this conflict and say, this is too much of a gamble for us. And they will not try to act in the Pacific. Already we're seeing, I think, the Middle East turning in the correct direction, largely because of Israeli leadership. And I think things can move in the right direction if we're just strong and remember our values.
Wow, this is serious stuff. I want to thank you, Jim. Former Ambassador and Governor of Virginia, Jim Gilmore, has been our guest today. And is there any place online that you'd like to direct people to if they want to stay abreast of what you're thinking about, what you're writing about?
I would like people to invite people to send me emails, and I will add them to a list, a distribution list that I have, and that is gilmoreambassador@gmail.com. People send me an email and just a comment or their own thoughts, which I'm happy to hear. And then at that point, I can add them to an email list and be in constant communication. Gilmoreambassador@gmail.com.
Well, Jim, I want to thank you once again for coming on the program and sharing your vast knowledge on this very serious topic. And I want to wish you the best with this happy holiday season that's coming up.
Thank you for the chance to speak to your listeners, and happy holidays to all of your listeners and to you, Tom.
Thank you. Bye bye.